Thomas Calloway was pressing his dead wife's name into her grave marker with his bare thumb. No gloves. January dark. The snow coming down like the sky had given up. When he heard something that didn't belong to the storm. He turned around. A girl was standing 10 feet away in the blizzard, with a baby locked in each arm, and her coat gone and her lips the color of ash. And she looked at him the way a person looked when they had run out of every other option on earth. "Please," she said, "the babies are dying." If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay until the very end. What happens to these children will stay with you. Now, let's begin. Thomas Calloway had been standing at Mel's grave for 20 minutes when the girl appeared. He hadn't heard her coming. The storm swallowed sound, had been swallowing everything since mid-afternoon. The wind and the snow folding the world down to about 30 feet in any direction, and then cutting it off clean. He'd come out here anyway, same as every January 14th. Same coat, same dark, same patch of ground behind the barn where he'd buried Nell and the baby together. Because the ground closer to the house felt too far, and the ground in town felt too final. He wasn't praying. He'd stopped that a long time ago. He was just present. Holding the date the way you held a thing that had no good place to be set down. The girl said please, and Thomas turned around, and the first thing he registered was not the baby's. It was her coat. She didn't have one. She'd taken it off. He could see the shape of it, wrapped and rewrapped around the 2 bundles she was holding, one to each side, her arms locked under them, her own shoulders in nothing but a thin wool dress soaked through with snow. She had given every layer she had to what she was carrying. She was 11 years old at the most, and she was already turning blue at the mouth. Thomas moved toward her, and she flinched back 1 step, and her arms tightened around the bundles, and he stopped. "I'm not taking them," he said. "I'm not taking anything. Stand still." He shrugged off his coat and held it out. She looked at it. She looked at him. She didn't move. "It goes around all 3 of you," he said. "Put your arms in and keep holding them. I'll button it." A pause that cost her. He could see it costing her. Every second she stood in the cold deciding whether to trust him was a second the babies lost heat. And she knew it, and he knew she knew it. And she still took 3 full seconds to decide. Then she stepped forward. He held the coat while she worked her arms through without letting go of either child. And he buttoned it from the bottom up without touching her. Just the fabric, just the buttons. And when it was done, he stepped back 2 full paces and put his hands where she could see them. "There's a house," he said. 10 yards. Fire's going." She looked at the house. She looked at him. "Move," she said. He moved. She followed. He got the back door open and stood aside, and she walked past him into the warmth without waiting to be invited. And he pulled the door shut behind them both, and the storm disappeared like someone had closed a book. The kitchen was lit by the stove and the lamp on the table. Thomas hung his hat and turned around. The girl was standing in the middle of the room, doing the same thing a spooked animal did when it came in from outside. Reading the exits. Door to the hall. Window over the sink. Distance between her and him. Her eyes moved fast and quiet, and she didn't try to hide that she was doing it. Thomas pulled out the chair at the far end of the table and sat down in it and stayed there. Gave her the room. Let her map it. "Set them down on the blanket chest," he said. "There, by the stove. They need the heat." "I'll hold them." "You're shaking so hard you're going to drop one." Her jaw went tight. Her arms were shaking. He was right, and she knew it, and she hated that he was right. She crossed to the blanket chest and sat down on the edge of it, and kept both babies against her chest and glared at him like that was a reasonable compromise. It was. He accepted it. "What are their names?" he said. She looked at him. "Henry and James," she said. "They're 4 months old. Henry's all right. James hasn't eaten since yesterday, and he sounds wrong when he breathes." She turned her chin down toward the smaller bundle on her right side. "He needs milk. The real kind." Thomas was already at the icebox. He pulled the milk crock out and set it on the stove to warm without being asked, and she watched him do it with those measuring eyes that had still not decided anything about him yet. "What's your name?" he said. "Pearl Hayes." "How old?" 11. "How far did you walk tonight?" "Far enough." He let that be what it was. He got a clean cloth from the drawer and a small cup and tested the milk against the inside of his wrist the way Nell had told him once. She'd read it in a book, said that's how you knew, and brought it to Pearl without getting too close, set it on the blanket chest beside her, and stepped back. She worked the cloth into James's mouth with the kind of practiced efficiency that told him she'd done this before, many times, in harder circumstances than this. The baby's hands came up, small fists grabbing at nothing, and his throat worked, and Pearl let out a breath so quiet Thomas almost didn't hear it. "Good boy," she said, low. Not to Thomas, just to the baby. "There you go, Jay. There you go." Thomas went back to the kitchen end of the room and put a pot on, because there needed to be something to do with his hands right now, and soup was the thing his hands knew how to do. He had almost not opened the barn door tonight. That was the part he kept turning over in his chest while he cut the salt pork and didn't look at the girl and the babies by the stove. He'd heard the sound and stood there in the storm with his hand on the barn door, and for 3 full seconds he'd told himself it was the wind. He'd needed it to be the wind, because January 14th was the one night a year he let himself be nobody. No ranch to run, no obligations, no next thing. Just a man standing at a grave in the dark, and whatever was on the other side of that barn door was going to be a next thing, whether he wanted it or not. He'd opened the door anyway. He didn't know yet if that made him a good man or just a man who couldn't stand himself when he chose wrong. There was a difference, and he wasn't always sure which one he was. "You're thinking loud," Pearl said from across the room. He looked up. She was watching him, with Henry half asleep against her shoulder, and James's eyes closed, the small chest rising and falling in something closer to a normal rhythm. "Soup'll be ready in 20 minutes, Thomas said. "I'm not talking about the soup." He set the spoon down, turned to face her. "All right." "You stood outside the barn door before you opened it," she said. "I heard your boots stop. You stood there a while." She looked at him without accusation, just accurate. "I understand that. I'm not angry about it. I just want to know if you're going to decide you want us to leave before morning." "I'm not." "You might, once I tell you things." "Then tell me things." She looked at James again. She did that every time she was about to say something hard. Looked at him first, like reminding herself what the hard things were for. "My father was Samuel Hayes," she said. "He worked Vance's number 4 shaft for 6 years. Aldous Vance, do you know who that is?" "Every man in 3 counties knows who that is." "Then you know what kind of man he is." She shifted Henry against her shoulder. "A year and a half ago, a hoist failed in the number 4 shaft. 3 men died. My father was one of them." She said it level and straight, not like it didn't hurt, like she'd decided the hurt didn't get to be in her voice right now. "Before he died, 2 weeks before, like he knew something was coming, he wrote everything down. Every faked inspection report. every bribed official, every piece of equipment Vance knew was failing and kept running anyway because replacing it cost money. She reached inside the front of her dress and pulled out an oilskin packet, flat and worn at the edges, and held it in her lap. He gave this to my mother and told her if anything happened to him, she had to find a way to get it to someone who could use it. Thomas looked at the packet. "Where's your mother?" he said. Pearl's hands went still around the oilskin. 4 full seconds of silence. "Vance took her," she said. 4 days ago. His men came to our house in Redstone with papers that said we owed money on the land, which was a lie. My father owned that land outright, paid in full. And when my mother said so, they took her anyway." Pearl's voice had dropped 1 register, not quieter, flatter, the kind of flat that costs something to hold. "She got us out the back door before they came through the front, put Henry and James in my arms, and told me to run. Said to find somebody good. Said she'd find us." A pause. "She said to trust that." "What's her name?" Thomas said. Pearl looked up at him. The question had surprised her. He could see it. "Dorothy," she said. "Dorothy Ann Hayes." Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not softness, more like the shape of the name in her mouth, doing something she hadn't expected it to do in front of a stranger. "She has dark hair and she's smaller than she looks, and she isn't afraid of anything." Her chin came up just a fraction. "She told me she'd find us. I believe her." Thomas turned back to the stove because he needed a moment, and the stove was the place you went when you needed a moment. Dorothy Ann Hayes. A woman who had gotten her children out a back door before Vance's men came through the front, and then stayed behind to face them. He didn't know her, but he knew the shape of what she'd done, and he felt it land in his chest the way true things landed, without asking permission. "There's a federal marshal in Denver," he said. "Cole Decker," Pearl said immediately. "My father wrote his name at the end of the last page. He said Decker was the one man in 4 states that Vance hadn't reached yet. Denver is 8 days from here in this weather." "I know. Copper Ridge Pass closes in 10 days if the second storm comes the way it's coming." "I know that too." She said it without flinching. "That's why I didn't stop moving." Thomas took the soup off the heat and carried 2 bowls to the table and pulled the chair out on her side without touching it and sat back down at his end. She came to the table and sat and ate. Henry held in the crook of her left arm. James asleep in the blanket she'd made on the chest by the stove. And she ate the way a person ate when they'd trained themselves not to show hunger. Controlled, measured, and then the control slipped just slightly after the 3rd spoonful, and the real hunger showed through. And she ate like what she was, a child who hadn't eaten properly in 4 days. Thomas cut cornbread and put it on her side of the table and didn't comment on any of it. "Vance has men in this county," he said. "I know." "If he knows you came this direction—" "He knows," Pearl said. "One of his men saw me on the Clearwater Road 2 nights ago. I ran into the tree line and lost him, but he saw which way I was going." She looked at Thomas directly. "That's why I didn't want to come inside when you first opened the door. I didn't want to put this on you." She looked down at her bowl. "But James was bad, and I didn't have any other choice left." "You made the right call." "I put you in danger." "Pearl." He said her name and waited until she looked up. "I'm a grown man on my own land. You're 11 years old with 2 babies in a blizzard. The danger isn't something you put on me. It's something we're both already in." He held her eyes. "The only question is what we do about it." She studied him, that measuring look again, slower now than it had been in the barn, less desperate, more deliberate, like she was taking her time because she'd decided she could afford to. "What do you want to do about it?" she said. "Tonight, you and the boys sleep inside and warm. In the morning—" He stopped. Something moved past the window, just for a second. A shape in the snow, indistinct, gone before he could name it. He kept his face steady and his voice level. "In the morning, we figure out the next part." Pearl had seen him look at the window. Her body had gone very still. "What was that?" she said. "Probably nothing." He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the white dark and the snow coming sideways and saw nothing. Nothing he could name. But the feeling in his stomach was not nothing. It was the feeling he'd had in the war when a tree line that should have been empty wasn't. That specific prickling at the back of the neck that a man learned to listen to if he wanted to stay alive. He went to the wall and took down the Winchester. Pearl watched him check the chamber without saying a word. "I need you to take the boys to the back room," he said. "Down the hall, second door on the right. No lamp." She was already on her feet with James in her arms. "Henry," she said. Thomas picked up Henry from the chest blanket, slowly, asked with his eyes, got her nod, and carried the boy down the hall and into the back room, and set him on the bed and stepped back out. Pearl came in behind him, and he pulled the door most of the way shut and stood in the hall and listened. Wind, snow against the windows, the stove clicking as it cooled. And then, far off, at the edge of where sound and storm separated, the sound of a horse standing still, not moving, just present. The specific weighted silence of an animal that had been told to wait and was waiting. Thomas went to the front window and looked out at his gate. One rider, sitting in the dark at the edge of the tree line, far enough back to be mostly invisible in the snow. Not moving, just watching the house. He stood at the window and looked back at the rider for a long, steady moment. And he thought about Nell, who used to say, "A good man didn't wait to be asked. He just saw what needed doing and did it." He thought about Pearl in the back room, holding her brothers in the dark. He thought about a woman named Dorothy Ann Hayes, who wasn't afraid of anything, and who had stayed behind so her children could run. Thomas Calloway walked to the back door and barred it. Walked to the front door and barred that too. Put another log on the fire because the boys needed the heat, and sat down in the chair facing the front door with the Winchester across his knees. If they came, they'd find him right here. Around 2 in the morning, Pearl came out of the back room and stood in the hallway with James against her chest and looked at Thomas in the firelight. The rifle, the barred door, the fact that he hadn't moved. "You're still up," she said. "I am." She came and sat in the other chair. She didn't ask about the rider. She'd heard enough through walls in her life to know what a man standing guard in his own house sounded like. After a while, she said, "My father told me there were still good men. Said you just had to look past the ones who weren't." Thomas didn't answer. "Henry and James," Pearl said quietly. "They're going to need to know who helped us. When they're old enough." She looked at James's face in the firelight, the small closed eyes, the chest rising and falling steady now. "What's your name? Your whole name?" "Thomas Calloway." She nodded, stored it. "I think my father was right," she said, "about there still being good men." She closed her eyes. Thomas sat with the rifle across his knees and the fire burning low, and 3 children in his house who weren't his, and a dead man's evidence on the kitchen table, and a rider who may or may not still be sitting in the tree line at his gate. And he felt something settle into him that hadn't been there when he walked out to Nell's grave 3 hours ago. Not peace. Nothing as easy as peace. Something that felt like direction. Like a compass that had been spinning loose for 5 years, suddenly finding north. He pressed his thumb against his knuckle and watched the door, and didn't find the watch hard at all. Outside, the January storm built itself higher. The snow came down without mercy and without preference, and the world beyond these walls shrank down to nothing. But in here the fire held, and the children breathed, and Thomas Calloway, who had spent 5 years becoming no one in particular, sat in the chair he'd sat in every night for 5 years, and felt it become, for the first time, the right place to be. The writer was gone by first light. Thomas knew it before he checked the window, because the particular quality of the silence outside had changed, from the waited, watching kind to the ordinary kind, just wind and snow and the sound of his horses moving in the barn. He stood at the glass anyway and looked out at the tree line and at the place where the rider had been, and saw nothing but the snow that had come down overnight and covered every track, every print, every evidence that anyone had been there at all. That was worse, in a way, than if the man had stayed. A man you could see was a man you could account for. A man who came, watched, and left clean in the night was a man delivering a message without words. And the message was, "We know where you are. We're not ready yet, but we know." Thomas put the Winchester back on the wall, not on the high hooks, the low ones, within reach, and went to the kitchen and started the stove. Pearl appeared in the hallway 10 minutes later, with Henry on her hip and James in the crook of her other arm, and her boots already on, and her eyes already tracking the room the way they always tracked a room. Except, this morning, there was something different underneath the tracking. Something that took him a moment to name. She'd slept. Not much, not deep, but enough that the very edge of the desperation had come down 1 degree. And what was underneath it was something closer to a person and further from a cornered animal. She looked at the Winchester on the low hooks. She looked at Thomas. "He's gone," Thomas said. "For now." "For now," he agreed. She came to the table and sat down, and settled James against her chest, and watched Thomas move around the kitchen, with the particular attention of someone who was deciding how much to rely on a thing before they knew how strong it was. He got the milk warming and cut bread and put the coffee on and didn't fill the silence with anything because the silence didn't need filling. Henry reached out one small fist toward the edge of the table and grabbed nothing and seemed satisfied with this. "He'll come back with more men," Pearl said. "Probably. Today or tomorrow?" "Tomorrow, more likely. Storm's still moving. Nobody travels in this if they don't have to." Thomas set the milk in front of her and sat down across the table. "But day after tomorrow, the storm breaks, and then, yes, more men." Pearl looked at James. The feeding ritual, cloth, cup, patient coaxing, had become something Thomas could read now, could tell the difference between a James who was taking it well and a James who wasn't. This morning, the boy was taking it well. His color was better. The worrying sound in his breathing had quieted overnight. Just slightly, enough to notice. "We need to talk about Denver," Pearl said. "We do." "The pass." 10 days, maybe 8 now. Thomas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I need to know everything your father wrote down in that packet. Not to read it, you keep it. But I need to know what we're carrying before I decide how to carry it." Pearl looked at him for a moment. Then she reached inside her dress and set the oilskin packet on the table between them, flat, and put her hand on top of it, but didn't open it. "My father worked Vance's mines for 6 years, she said. "He started in number 2 shaft, moved to number 4 when they opened it in 79. He was a careful man, quiet. He didn't talk much, but he watched everything." She pressed her palm flat against the oilskin. "He started keeping records 2 years before he died, because he saw things that didn't match the official reports. Equipment that got written up as inspected, and wasn't. Timber supports that should have been replaced, and didn't get replaced. gas levels that the shift foreman recorded one number and my father recorded a different number in his own book. She paused. 3 men died in the number 4 shaft in a hoist failure in the summer of '81. Vance's inspector ruled it an accident. Equipment failure, unavoidable, no fault. Her jaw tightened. My father had been writing down the condition of that hoist for 4 months before it failed. He had dates. He had numbers. He had the name of the inspector Vance paid to write the report the way Vance wanted it written. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's a federal safety violation. Multiple counts. It's more than that. Pearl's voice was steady, but her hand pressed harder on the packet. My father also found payments. He couldn't access Vance's accounts directly, but he had a friend in the company office. A man named Ellis, older, who didn't like what he was seeing either. Ellis passed my father copies of certain ledger pages. Payments to 2 county commissioners. Payments to the territorial mine inspector's office. Payments to a judge in Cheyenne. She looked up at Thomas. It's not just that men died. It's that every person who should have stopped it got paid not to. The kitchen was very quiet. Henry made a small, contented sound and grabbed at the air again. Marshal Decker, Thomas said. My father wrote that Decker had been trying to build a case against Vance for 2 years, but couldn't get anyone inside to talk. Everyone was either paid or scared. Pearl looked at the packet. He said what Decker needed was someone willing to hand him the inside material directly. Someone who wasn't on Vance's payroll and couldn't be threatened into silence. She paused. He died before he could get it to him. And your mother held it. For 1.5 years. She was trying to find a way to reach Decker without Vance knowing. Vance has watchers in Redstone. Everyone knows it. You can't send a letter from Redstone without him knowing about it inside a day. Pearl finally lifted her hand from the oilskin. She was still trying to figure it out when they came for her. Thomas stood up. He went to the window, not because he expected to see anything, but because he needed to move, and the window was the direction his feet went when thinking demanded space. Outside, the snow was lighter now than it had been at midnight, still coming but thinning, the sky going from solid white to gray with patches. The particular gray that meant the first part of the storm was ending, and the pause before the second part was beginning. 2 days, maybe 3. There's a woman in Clearwater, he said. Ruth Anders, runs the dry goods store on the main street. She's been in this county longer than Vance has, and she doesn't owe him a thing. He turned from the window. She'll know what's moving on the roads. She'll know if Vance has men posted between here and the pass. Can you trust her? I've trusted her for 12 years. Pearl considered this. You'd have to go into town. I'd have to go into town. And leave us here. Thomas looked at her. She wasn't asking him not to go. She wasn't asking him to stay. She was laying the fact out flat and looking at it the same way she looked at everything. Straight. No decoration. Wanting to know what it actually was before she decided what to do with it. I'd be back before noon, he said. Storm's light enough now to ride. I'll bar both doors and leave you the... He stopped. He looked at the Winchester on the low hooks. He looked at Pearl. I know how to shoot, Pearl said. He believed her. He took the Winchester down and checked the chamber and carried it to the table and set it down in front of her. Then he went to the shelf above the back door and brought down the box of ammunition and set that beside it. Pearl looked at the rifle. She looked at him. She didn't touch it yet, just looked at it with the expression of someone acknowledging a wait before they picked it up. If anyone comes to that door before I get back, Thomas said, you don't open it. You take the boys to the back room, the same room as last night, and you bar the door from inside. The window in that room faces the barn. If I come back and the front's blocked, I'll come through the barn and knock 3 times on that window. 3 times. He held up 3 fingers. Anything other than 3 knocks, you don't open. And if they get through the front door before the 3 knocks? Thomas looked at the rifle. Pearl nodded once. Short. She understood. He got his coat and his hat and his horse ready, and he rode into Clearwater in the gray morning light, with the storm thin above him and the particular feeling in his stomach of a man who has left something behind that matters and is riding as fast as decency allows. Ruth Anders was behind her counter when he walked in, and she looked at his face and said, "Close the door," before he'd said a single word. He closed it. "Vance has 3 men in town," she said, already low, already leaning across the counter. "Came in yesterday afternoon ahead of the storm. 2 of them I know, Hargrove and a man called Beale, who does Vance's collecting in the South County. The 3rd one I don't know, which worries me more than the ones I do." She looked at Thomas steadily. Ruth Anders had a face that had been used for 60 years and had come out the other side of all of it with something intact that a lot of people lost much earlier. A plain, undisguised willingness to look at hard things and say what they were. "They've been asking about a girl, red hair, traveling with infants." Thomas said nothing. "I told them I hadn't seen anyone of that description," Ruth said, which was true at the time. She looked at him. "Is it still true?" Thomas held her eyes. "I need to know what they know about the pass." Ruth's expression shifted. Not surprise, she was past surprise, but something acknowledging. "The pass," she said. "Then you're moving them." "Soon as I know the road." She turned and went through the curtain to the back room and came back with a hand-drawn county map, old and creased, and spread it on the counter. Thomas leaned over it. "Hargrove went out to the East Road yesterday evening before the storm got bad," Ruth said, pointing. "I don't know what he found, but he came back looking satisfied, which is never a good sign with Hargrove." She moved her finger to the pass route. "The main road to Copper Ridge. I'd say there's a good chance he's got someone posted here." She tapped a spot 8 miles below the pass. "Widow Creek Crossing. Narrow, only one way through. Easy to watch." "What about the Mill Road?" Ruth looked at him. "The Mill Road hasn't been passable in winter for 10 years. It was passable last March. I came through it with a full wagon." "March isn't January." "No," Thomas said. "But it goes around Widow Creek by 4 miles and comes up behind the pass station from the north side." He looked at the map. "If the snow isn't too deep in the lower canyon." "That's a significant if, Thomas." "I know what it is." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at the map, and then looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one she got when she was deciding whether to say the thing she actually thought or the thing that was easier to hear. She said the thing she actually thought. "Vance isn't going to let this go when the girl gets to Denver," she said. "Even if Decker takes the case. Even if it goes federal. Vance has reach and he has money, and men with money and reach don't go down fast or clean." She folded the map and held it out to Thomas. "I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying know what you're starting." Thomas took the map. "I know what I'm starting." "Do you know what you're doing it for?" He put the map in his coat. He thought about Pearl at his kitchen table, with 2 babies and a dead man's evidence, and that flat, straight, accurate voice that didn't ask for anything it didn't actually need. He thought about Dorothy Ann Hayes, who had stayed behind so her children could run, and who was sitting in a room somewhere in Redstone right now, waiting on a daughter who'd told her she'd find somebody good. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Ruth held his eyes for a long moment. Then she went back behind the counter and pulled out a canvas sack and began filling it without being asked. Dried beef, hard biscuit, 2 tins of condensed milk, a jar of something she put in last that clinked against the others. "For the babies," she said. "The condensed milk. Easier to carry than fresh." She tied the sack and held it over the counter. "The third man, the one I don't know. He was asking about you specifically this morning. By name." Thomas took the sack. "What did you tell him?" "That you were a quiet man who kept to himself, and that in 12 years I'd never seen you do a thing worth talking about." She held his gaze. "I hope I'm about to be wrong about that." He rode back hard. The barn was quiet when he came through the gate, and the house looked the same as he'd left it. Curtains still, no smoke from anything but the main chimney, both doors tight. He put the horse up fast and went through the barn to the back window and knocked 3 times. A pause. 4 seconds. 5. Then the bar scraped back from the inside of the back door, and Pearl opened it 8 inches and looked at him, and then opened it the rest of the way. "You were 12 minutes longer than you said," she said. "Ruth had things to tell me." "Good things or bad things?" "Things." He came inside and set the canvas sack on the table and pulled out the condensed milk and handed it to her first. She looked at it, and something moved through her expression that she shut down fast. But not fast enough. He'd seen it. The particular look of someone who has been managing on not enough for long enough that enough catches them off guard. She set it on the table beside James, who was awake now and doing the grabbing at nothing thing that seemed to be his primary occupation, and she looked at Thomas. "The man who watched the house last night," she said. "He came back, didn't he? Before you got back." Thomas looked at her. "What happened?" "He didn't come to the door. He stood at the fence for a while." She crossed her arms. "I watched him through the back window. He just stood there and looked at the house, and then he left." She held Thomas's eyes. "He wanted me to see him." Thomas put the map on the table. "We're leaving day after tomorrow," he said. "Before the second storm and before Vance decides waiting is done." He spread the map and pointed to the mill road. "We go this way, around Widow Creek. It's longer and it's harder, and the canyon might slow us, but it keeps us off the road they're watching." Pearl looked at the map. She was quiet for a moment. "Day after tomorrow," she said slowly. "That's cutting it close on the pass." "I know. If we hit trouble on the mill road and it slows us 2 days..." "I know, Pearl." She looked up from the map. She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes, and whatever she found in his face, she seemed to accept, because she didn't push further on the timing. She understood that he'd already turned it over every way it could be turned, and this was the answer that came out. "All right," she said. "Day after tomorrow." Henry chose this moment to make a sound of deep and serious complaint, and Pearl turned to him with the automatic focus of someone whose attention was always divided and never fully split. And Thomas watched her settle the boy against her hip and talk him down from whatever offense the universe had committed against him this time. And he thought about what Ruth had said. "Know what you're doing it for." He looked at these 2 boys who had come into his house with nothing but the sister who had carried them here, and he thought about a room at the end of the hall that had been shut for 5 years, and he thought about the specific weight of a small child held against a man's chest in the cold. And he knew. He knew exactly what he was doing it for. He just hadn't let himself say it plainly yet, not even to himself. He folded the map and put it in his coat pocket, and went to the stove to start the midday meal. And behind him, Pearl talked Henry down to quiet, and James grabbed at the air and found nothing, and seemed to consider this acceptable. And outside the storm gathered itself for its second coming. And Thomas Calloway moved around his kitchen that had been a dead man's kitchen for 5 years, and felt it, for the second morning in a row, belonged to something alive. The day before they were supposed to leave was the longest day Thomas Calloway could remember in 5 years of long days. It started quiet. Too quiet. The way things went quiet before they didn't. The second storm hadn't arrived yet, but its intention was everywhere. In the sky that had gone the particular yellowish gray that old-timers called a liar's sky, because it looked almost peaceful right before it turned on you. In the way the horses were restless in the barn all morning without cause. In the way Pearl kept checking the window and then checking it again 10 minutes later, even though nothing had changed. Thomas split firewood in the morning and stacked it against the house, and split more than he needed because his hands needed the work. Pearl fed the boys and walked them and talked to them in that low, steady voice, and helped Thomas without being asked, holding the door, passing things, doing the small, practical work of someone who had decided that useful was safer than idle. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Something had settled between them in the last 2 days that didn't require conversation to maintain. A kind of working understanding. The particular ease that came not from knowing everything about a person, but from having seen how they moved under pressure and decided the answer was acceptable. Around mid-morning, James said his first real sound. Not a cry, not a complaint, but something that was almost a laugh. A short, bright noise directed at nothing in particular. And Pearl looked up from the stove so fast she nearly knocked the pot and said, "Jay." Just his name. Just that, in a voice Thomas had not heard from her before. Something completely unguarded. Something young. Then she caught herself and looked at Thomas with a flash of self-consciousness that she shut down fast. Thomas looked at James. "That's a good sign," he said. "He does that sometimes," Pearl said. She turned back to the stove. "He did it once before, in Redstone. Mama—" She stopped. She adjusted her grip on the pot handle. "Mama said he had my father's sense of humor. Said my father always laughed at things nobody else saw coming." Thomas didn't answer that. He let it sit in the room because it deserved to sit there. After a while, Pearl said, "Do you think she's all right?" He knew who she meant. "I think she's a woman who knows how to stay necessary to someone who wants something from her," Thomas said carefully. "As long as Vance thinks she knows where that packet is, she's too valuable to hurt." Pearl's jaw worked. "And when he figures out she sent it with me?" "He already suspects she sent it with you. That's why he sent men after you." Thomas carried the wood box to the fireplace and set it down. "But suspecting isn't the same as knowing. Your mother's smart. She'll know how to keep him uncertain." Pearl set the pot on the table and sat down, and for a long moment she just held Henry against her chest and looked at the middle distance with an expression that she usually didn't let stay on her face for more than a second or two. The expression of a child who missed her mother. Plain and simple, and devastating in its plainness. "She told me she'd find us," Pearl said. "She said it like she meant it." "She did mean it." Pearl looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because she got you out," Thomas said. "A woman who just wanted to say something comforting sends you out the back door with a kind word. A woman who means it sends you out with the one thing that could actually stop the man coming through her front door." He looked at Pearl directly. "She gave you the packet. She gave you the name Cole Deckard. She gave you a direction." He paused. "That's not goodbye. That's a plan." Pearl looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved. Something she pressed down fast, but not before he saw it. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to the relief of being told something you already believed and needed to hear, said out loud by someone else. "All right," she said quietly. They ate. Thomas went over the route again. The mill road, the canyon, the place where the road narrowed, and would need to be checked before they brought the wagon through. He talked Pearl through it, not because she needed to know every detail, but because he'd found in the last 2 days that she did better with the full shape of a thing than with pieces of it handed over one at a time. She didn't panic when she knew everything. She only became unmanageable when she suspected she was being protected from something. He was explaining the creek crossing below the canyon when the knock came, not at the back door, the front. 3 hard knocks, evenly spaced. The knock of someone who had every right to knock and knew it. Pearl was on her feet before the 3rd knock finished. She had Henry in her arms, and she looked at Thomas, and he was already standing and already pointing down the hall with 2 fingers, and she went, fast and quiet. James from the blanket chest in one smooth motion, both boys against her chest, down the hall to the back room without a word. Thomas took the Winchester from the low hooks. He went to the front door and stood to the side of it, not in front, and said, "Who's there?" A pause. Then a voice he didn't know. Smooth, almost pleasant. The kind of voice that had learned pleasantness as a tool and used it the way other men used a hammer. "Name's Beale. I'm looking for a Mr. Thomas Calloway. I'd appreciate a moment of his time." Thomas had heard that name this morning. Ruth had said it across her counter with a particular flatness. Beale, who does Vance's collecting in the South County. A collector. A man whose job was to show up at doors and make the person on the other side understand that the wrong answer had consequences. "What do you want?" Thomas said. "Mr. Calloway, I'd rather not talk through a door in this cold if it's all the same to you. I'm alone. I'm not here to cause trouble. Mr. Vance simply asked me to pass along a message." Thomas opened the door. Beale was perhaps 40, lean through the face, with the careful, groomed look of a man who took pains to appear unthreatening because he'd learned it was more effective than appearing dangerous. He was alone, as he'd said. His hands were visible. He looked at the Winchester in Thomas's hands and smiled like it was a mildly amusing detail. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "Thank you." "Say your piece." Beale reached into his coat slowly and produced an envelope and held it out. Thomas didn't take it. Beale set it on the porch railing. "Mr. Vance is a reasonable man," Beale said. "He has a situation that's gotten complicated, and he'd like to simplify it. The situation involves some property of his that's gone missing. Documents. Personal business records that belong to him and that he'd like returned." He kept his voice friendly, conversational, like they were discussing a fence line dispute. "He understands that you may have come across some individuals who are in possession of these documents without being fully aware of the trouble that creates for themselves or for anyone helping them." Thomas said nothing. "The envelope contains $500, Beale said. "Mr. Vance is offering it to any man who returns his property to him and steps away from this matter. No questions, no trouble. The money is simply for the inconvenience." He smiled again. "That's a fair sum for a man running a cattle operation in a hard winter." Thomas looked at the envelope on the railing. He looked at Beale. "You can tell Mr. Vance," he said, "that I haven't seen any documents. I haven't seen any property belonging to him of any kind." He kept his voice the same temperature it had been at the beginning. Flat. Even. Nothing in it to push against. "And I'd suggest he send his men off my fence line before I ride into Clearwater and speak to the county sheriff about trespassing." Beale's smile didn't move. "Mr. Vance has a good relationship with Sheriff Pell." "I expect he does," Thomas said, "which is why I'd go to Clearwater and not stop there. I'd keep going to Cheyenne, to the territorial marshal's office." He looked at Beale directly. "Documents travel faster than men in winter, Mr. Beale. Something to consider." The smile went away. Not fast, slow, the way something went away when it had decided it was done being useful. Beale looked at Thomas with a different kind of attention now, the kind that wasn't performing anything, just measuring. "You understand what you're involving yourself in," Beale said. "This isn't a local matter." "No," Thomas said. "It isn't." Beale studied him for one more moment. Then he picked the envelope up from the railing and put it back in his coat. "Mr. Vance will want a direct answer by tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll come back then." "You're welcome to come back," Thomas said. "You'll get the same answer." He shut the door. He stood in the hallway for a count of 10, listening to Beale's footsteps leave the porch, listening to the crunch of boots in snow going toward the gate, listening until he heard a horse move off down the road. Then he went to the back room and knocked 3 times. The bar scraped. Pearl opened the door. She had Henry on her left hip and James cradled in her right arm, and the Winchester Thomas had left in the room, propped against the wall within reach. And her face had the look of someone who had heard voices through walls and had been standing with that rifle within arm's reach for the last 10 minutes, deciding whether the moment had come. "Beale," Thomas said. "One of Vance's collectors." "I know that name." Pearl's voice was tight. "He came to our house in Redstone once, a year ago, about the land payment." She looked at Thomas. "What did he want?" $500 for the packet and for me to step away." Pearl went very still. "What did you say?" "I said no." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she sometimes did when she was checking something against something else she already knew, like she was holding 2 pieces up to the light to see if they matched. "He'll be back tomorrow," she said. "He said so." "With more men?" "Likely." "Then we can't wait until day after tomorrow." She shifted Henry against her hip, and he grabbed a fistful of her hair without concern. "We have to go. Tonight." Thomas had already been turning that over since the moment he shut the door. The mill road in darkness was a different thing than the mill road in daylight. Harder, slower, more margin for the wagon to go wrong in the canyon. But Beale coming back tomorrow with a direct answer required meant Beale coming back tomorrow with men enough to enforce whatever the answer was. Tonight had its own risks. Tomorrow had certainty. "Tonight," he said. "Late. After midnight, when the road's empty." Pearl nodded. She had already known that was what he would say. He could see it. She'd been waiting for him to arrive at it on his own. They spent the afternoon preparing without speaking about what they were preparing for. Thomas loaded the wagon in the barn, out of sight from the road. Provisions, the bedroll, the ammunition box, the canvas sack from Ruth. He hitched the 2 steadiest horses, Belle and the gray mare he'd never named, and left them untied and ready inside the barn, where they'd stay warm until it was time. Pearl put together what little the children needed. The oilskin packet went back inside her dress, next to her skin, where it had been when she walked in from the storm. She didn't need to tell Thomas that was where it was going. He already knew. Around 4 in the afternoon, the snow began again. Not the second storm yet, just its advance, the first thin sifting that came before the real weight. Thomas stood at the barn door and looked at it coming down, and thought about the canyon road and what thin sifting became by midnight, and did the arithmetic in his head again, and came to the same answer. Tonight was still better than tomorrow. He went inside, and Pearl had both boys down for what sleep she could get into them, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood in front of her, her palms down, the gesture he'd come to recognize as the one she used when she needed her hands to stay still. Thomas sat across from her. "Tell me about your father," he said. She looked up, surprised, not alarmed, just surprised. It wasn't a question she'd expected. "Why?" she said. "Because you've been carrying what he left you for 4 days through a Wyoming blizzard, and I reckon he deserves to be more than a name." Pearl was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. "He was quiet," she said. "Quieter than you. He didn't talk much, but when he talked, it meant something, so everybody listened." The edge of her mouth moved, something almost a smile, gone fast. "He used to get up before dawn and sit outside with his coffee, even in winter. Mama used to say he was the only man alive who didn't understand that cold was a problem." She paused. "He taught me the stars. Said if you knew the stars, you could never be lost. Not really. You could always figure out which way was north." She stopped. "I've been using that," she said. "These 4 days, traveling at night. I used his stars to keep going the right direction." Thomas said nothing. He let the room hold it. Pearl pressed her hands flatter against the table. "He wrote me a letter," she said. "Not in the packet. A different one. My mother gave it to me the morning she sent us out." Her throat moved. "He wrote it 2 weeks before the accident. Like he knew." She didn't go on for a moment. When she did, her voice was level again, but the effort was visible. He said, "Pearl, you are the bravest person I know, and I never told you enough. He said, take care of your brothers. He said, find somebody good." She looked up at Thomas. "That's why I came here." Thomas looked at her. This 11-year-old girl who had navigated 4 days of winter dark by the stars her father taught her, carrying her father's evidence against the man who killed him, looking for the kind of man her father had told her still existed. He thought about Nell. He thought about what she would say right now, looking at this child across his kitchen table. She would say, "Thomas, don't you dare waste this." "Your father knew what he was doing when he wrote that letter," Thomas said. "And you knew what you were doing when you knocked on that barn door." He held Pearl's eyes. "He told you to find somebody good. You did." Pearl looked at him for a long moment. Her hands stayed flat on the table. "You didn't ask for this," she said. "No. It's going to be dangerous. Most things worth doing are." She was quiet. She was turning it over the way she turned everything over. All the angles, all the weight of it, what it cost him, and whether he understood what it cost. She needed to know he understood before she could let herself accept it. He'd figured that out about her on the first night. Pearl Hayes didn't take something from a person who didn't know the full price. "Vance will come after you, even after we get to Denver," she said. "Even after Decker has everything." "I know that." "He'll find ways to make your life difficult. Your ranch, your business, your name in this county." "Pearl." Thomas said her name and waited. She stopped. "I know what I'm taking on. I knew it when I opened that barn door, and I knew it when I told Beale no this afternoon, and I know it right now." He looked at her steadily, the same look he'd given Beale, flat and certain, and without anything in it that could be pushed. "These children came to my door in the snow," he said. "That means they're mine to see safe. Any man who wants to argue that is welcome to come argue it to my face." The kitchen was quiet. Pearl looked at him for a long time. That look with no measurement left in it, no more checking, no more calculating the distance between what a person said and what they were. Just looking. The way you looked at something you had decided was true. "Okay," she said. "Just that. No decoration." Thomas stood up. "Get some sleep if you can. We leave at midnight." She stood and picked up Henry from beside the stove and went down the hall. And at the doorway she paused without turning around. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her back. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I think he would have said you were the kind of man that makes the other kind worth tolerating." She went through the doorway. Thomas stood in the kitchen alone and put both hands flat on the table, palms down, and breathed. Outside, the snow came down steadily, the advance of the second storm building itself one flake at a time into the thing it was going to become. The fire held in the hearth. The clock on the wall moved toward midnight. And Thomas Calloway, who had spent 5 years with his hands empty, stood in the kitchen that was starting to feel like something other than a dead man's house, and felt the full, specific weight of what he had just said, and meant every word of it. Not like a decision, like something he had always known was true, waiting on the right moment to say itself out loud. He put another log on the fire for the warmth the boys would need. Then he went to the barn to finish what needed finishing before midnight came. Midnight came the way midnight came in a Wyoming winter. Not announced, just present. The clock hand moving to 12, while the world outside stayed exactly as dark and cold and indifferent as it had been at 11, and would be at 1. Thomas had the wagon ready. He'd packed the last of it while Pearl slept. 2 hours, maybe less. The half-sleep of someone whose body had demanded it and whose mind had refused to fully surrender. He'd heard her in the back room, the small sounds of a child fighting rest and losing. And he'd let her have every minute of it, because what was coming required whatever she had left, and he wasn't going to take a single minute of it from her before he had to. He woke her at 11:45 with a knock, and her name said quietly through the door. She came out already dressed, boots on, Henry bundled against her chest with a wrapping she'd perfected over 4 days of carrying him, James in the crook of her arm. She looked at Thomas, and he held up the canvas sack, and she understood. Condensed milk already inside, enough for 2 days. They didn't speak going through the house. Thomas banked the fire low enough that it wouldn't die, but wouldn't throw light through the windows either. And he took one last look at the kitchen. Table, stove, the 2 chairs by the fire. The room that had been nobody's room for 5 years, and had been something else entirely for 3 days. And he went out through the back and closed the door behind him. The barn was warm with horse breath and hay smell. Belle shifted when they came in, and Thomas put his hand flat on her neck, and she stilled. He got Pearl and the boys into the wagon bed, arranged the bedroll and the extra blankets so the boys were fully covered, and Pearl had her back against the side with her legs stretched in front of her and both hands free. "The Winchester is under the left board," he said. "Behind you. You'll feel it." She reached back without looking, and her hand found the rifle stock. She pulled it out, checked it the way he'd shown her, put it across her knees. Thomas climbed to the seat and took the reins, and pushed the horses forward into the dark. The mill road turned off the main road 2 miles east of his gate, marked by nothing except a leaning post that had lost its sign 3 winters ago. Thomas knew it by the particular gap in the tree line, and by 12 years of riding past it. He turned the horses without slowing, and the wagon wheels dropped off the packed main road onto the softer ground of the mill road, and the sound changed. Less crunch, more give. The snow deeper here where no one had traveled in weeks. He kept the horses to a walk. No lamp. The moon was behind clouds, but the snow on the ground threw back enough light to see 20 feet ahead, which was enough. Barely, but enough. Pearl was quiet behind him for the first mile. Then she said, low, "How far to the canyon?" 6 miles on this road, maybe 7 in the snow. And through the canyon. 3 more to where the mill road meets the pass route, then 8 miles to the pass station. He paused. If the canyon's clear. What if it isn't? We find out when we get there, he said. One thing at a time. She accepted that. He heard her settle back against the wagon side. They moved through the dark, with the snow coming down in that thin, persistent way it had been coming since afternoon. Not heavy enough to stop them, but enough to soften every sound. enough to make the world feel smaller than it was. The trees pressing in on both sides, and the road ahead appearing only a few feet at a time, like it was being made as they moved forward. Thomas thought about Beale. He thought about Beale going back to Vance tonight and reporting what Thomas had said and how he'd said it. He thought about what Vance would do with that report. Vance was not a man who operated on anger. Ruth had said that once, years ago, when Vance's name had first started appearing in conversations about land and mines and men who'd sold for less than their property was worth. She'd said, "He's not a man who loses his temper. He makes calculations." That was the more dangerous kind. A calculating man who'd sent Beale with $500 and gotten no was going to make a new calculation. Thomas didn't know exactly what that calculation looked like, but he knew it wouldn't wait until morning, which was why they were on the mill road at midnight instead of in their beds. The first 3 miles went without trouble. The horses were steady, Belle in particular, who had the temperament of an animal that had decided a long time ago that whatever Thomas pointed her at was probably fine, and the gray mare following her lead with the particular trust that horses gave to other horses they respected. The snow was deep, but not impossible. The road clear enough underneath to keep the wagon from bogging. Pearl fed James somewhere in the 2nd mile, managing the condensed milk and the cloth in the dark with the practiced competence that still made something tighten in Thomas's chest when he witnessed it. The ease of it. The terrible ease of a child who had been doing this long enough that it required no thought. Henry slept. James ate and then slept. Pearl settled back with the Winchester across her knees and her eyes on the darkness around them. They hit the canyon entrance at what Thomas estimated was 2 in the morning. He pulled the horses to a stop and sat for a moment, reading what was in front of them. The canyon was narrow, 20 feet across at its widest, the walls rising steeply on both sides, the road dropping slightly as it went through. In summer, it was unremarkable. In January, it was a different negotiation entirely, because whatever snow came down off those walls had nowhere to go but onto the road. He climbed down and walked ahead on foot, testing the depth with each step. 6 inches. 8. A foot in one low spot. Manageable. He went 50 yards in, turned around, came back. "It's passable," he said, "but I'm going to walk the horses through. It'll be slow." "I'll walk too," Pearl said. "The boys need to stay in the wagon." "I know. I mean after." She looked at the canyon entrance. "If the snow gets deeper in there and the wagon gets stuck, you'll need someone to lead the horses while you push." She was right. He didn't waste time telling her so. They went into the canyon that way, Thomas at the horses' heads, one hand on Belle's bridle, talking to her low and steady the way he always talked to horses in situations that required their patience, and Pearl a step behind him with James held against her chest, and Henry bundled in the wagon bed. The canyon walls closed in around them, and the darkness became more complete. The snow light cut off above, and Thomas moved by feel and the warmth of the horses and the sound of the road under his boots. The deep spot came at the canyon's midpoint. He felt the wagon slow before he heard it, felt it in the resistance through Belle's bridle, the change in the horse's effort, and then the left rear wheel went in and kept going, and the wagon listed and stopped. "Hold," he said. Belle stopped. The gray stopped. Thomas went back to the wheel, buried to the hub. He put his hand in the snow and found the edge of a rut, an old rut, summer road damage that had filled with meltwater and frozen, and then been covered by 2 feet of new snow. The wheel had found it like it was looking. He stood up. He thought for 3 seconds. "Pearl." "I see it," she said. She was already moving, already transferring James to the wagon bed with the careful speed of someone who'd made this exact calculation and come to the same answer. She came to Belle's head and took the bridle below Thomas's hand without being told. "When I say push, walk them forward," Thomas said. "Steady. Don't rush." He went to the rear of the wagon and got his shoulder against the frame above the stuck wheel and set his feet against the packed snow underneath. "Push," he said. Pearl spoke to Belle, low and certain, the same pitch Thomas used. He noticed that. She'd taken the pitch from watching him. And the horses leaned into their harnesses, and Thomas drove with his legs, and the wagon groaned and shifted, and the wheel came up out of the rut with a sound like something tearing loose, and the wagon rolled forward, and Thomas nearly went face first into the snow before he caught himself on the tailboard. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the wagon, and his breath coming hard, and the cold hitting his lungs in a way that made them ache. "You all right?" Pearl said from the front. "Fine." He wasn't entirely fine. He twisted something in his left shoulder getting under the wagon, but fine enough. And the canyon was navigable, and that was the thing that mattered right now. They came out the other side 20 minutes later. The road opened up, and the snowlight came back, and Thomas could see a quarter-mile ahead to where the mill road met the pass route, and he stood at Belle's head for a moment and just breathed. Pearl came up beside him. "Good," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him with the sidelong precision she used when she was checking something she didn't want to be obvious about checking. "Your shoulder." "It's manageable." "Thomas." "Pearl." He looked at her. "It's manageable. Get in the wagon." She got in the wagon. They turned onto the pass route, and Thomas put the horses to a steadier pace now that the road was packed and known. 6 miles to Clearwater, 2 more to the pass. They needed to be through the pass before the second storm found them, and the sky to the northwest was doing something Thomas didn't like. A darkness that was darker than the surrounding dark. The advancing edge of what was coming. 4 miles from the pass station he saw the light, a single lamp off the road to the right, at the edge of the tree line. Not moving, just burning. The kind of lamp a person left burning when they wanted someone to see it without making themselves visible. Thomas pulled the horses to a stop. Pearl had seen it. She was already sitting up straight with the rifle across her knees. "Signal or trap?" she said. "Don't know yet." He sat still and watched the lamp, and the lamp didn't move, and nothing came out of the trees toward them. A trap would have moved by now. Men who'd set an ambush didn't let a stopped wagon sit on the road while they waited. They moved when the target stopped moving, because a stopped target was a target that might turn around. The lamp just burned. "I'm going to go look," he said. "Thomas!" "Stay with the boys." He climbed down. "If I'm not back in 5 minutes, you drive the horses forward. Don't stop for anything until the pass station." He walked toward the lamp with his hand on the colt at his hip, and his eyes on the tree line, and his steps as quiet as he could make them in 6 inches of snow, which was not very quiet, but quiet enough to hear if something moved ahead of him. He was 20 feet from the lamp when the figure stepped out from behind the tree that had been hiding it. A woman, small, dark-haired, one hand raised palm out, and the other holding the lamp, and both visible and deliberate about being visible. She was wearing a man's coat that was too big for her, and her face had something wrong with it on the left side. A darkening along the jaw that the lamplight made worse than it maybe was, and better than it maybe was at the same time. She looked at Thomas, and she said, "I'm not armed. I have been walking since yesterday morning. My name is Dorothy Hayes, and I believe you have my children." Thomas Calloway stood in the snow and felt something happen in his chest that had nothing to do with cold or exhaustion or the ache in his shoulder. He looked at her. The dark hair, the steadiness, the jaw. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Yes, you do." She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them, and they were bright in the lamplight, and she held herself very straight. "Are they all right?" she said. "All three." "All three," Thomas said. "James was sick the first night. He's better now. Pearl—" He stopped. He looked back at the wagon. Pearl never stopped. Dorothy looked past him toward the wagon, and something moved through her face that was bigger than anything he'd seen on a face in a long time. She pressed her lips together and held it with everything she had, and managed it down to something that only showed at the very edges. "How far back is she?" Dorothy said. 50 yards. "Take me to her." He walked her back to the wagon, and he didn't say anything on the way, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and he understood that. Pearl saw them coming. He would think about it later, the exact moment Pearl saw her mother walking toward the wagon in the lamplight. He would think about how Pearl made no sound at first, how she simply stood up in the wagon bed with Henry against her chest and James in her arm, and stood there completely still for 1 full second. The way a person went still when something happened that they had been holding the possibility of for so long that the reality of it needed a moment to become real. Then she said, "Mama." Not loud, barely above a whisper. Dorothy was already at the wagon side. Her hands came up, and Pearl bent down, and Dorothy took James first. Automatic, careful, a mother's hands. And then her other arm came around Pearl, and Pearl put her face against her mother's shoulder, and the sound that came out of her was the sound Thomas had heard once before, the night he'd stayed awake while she slept. The sound she made in her sleep, when whatever she was holding in her waking hours got loose for a few minutes. But she was awake now, and she let it come, and it lasted about 10 seconds, and then she pulled back and wiped her face fast with the back of her hand and straightened and looked at her mother and said with a voice that was only slightly unsteady, "I knew you'd find us." "I told you I would," Dorothy said. "I know, I just—" Pearl stopped. She looked at her mother's jaw. Her expression changed, went tight and still. "He did that." "It doesn't matter." "Mama." "Pearl." Dorothy's voice was quiet and final. "It doesn't matter right now. What matters is right now." She looked at Thomas over her daughter's shoulder. The look was steady and direct and carried everything in it. The gratitude, the assessment, the particular measuring quality that Pearl had inherited whole and unmodified. The same instrument, calibrated by the same years of needing it. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Ma'am?" "My daughter's letter said you were a good man to find." Thomas looked at Pearl. Pearl was looking at her mother and wasn't looking at him, and he could see the profile of her face, the jaw that matched her mother's jaw, the eyes that matched her mother's eyes, and he thought about 4 days of January dark and a dead man's stars, and an 11-year-old girl who had navigated a blizzard on astronomical precision because her father had loved her enough to teach her how. "She found the right one," he said. Dorothy looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned to the wagon and climbed up with James still in her arm, one-handed, with the ease of a woman who had been doing hard things with her body her whole life, and had stopped remarking on it. Pearl sat beside her, and Thomas climbed to the seat and took the reins and pushed the horses forward, because there were still 6 miles to the pass, and a darkening northwest sky, and the second storm that didn't care about reunions. "How did you get out?" Pearl said. Behind him, low, already debriefing, already needing to know the full shape. "Ellis," Dorothy said. "Your father's friend from the company office. He's been watching for his chance for 2 years. When Vance moved me to the Clearwater office 2 nights ago, he thought a different location would make me more manageable. Ellis got a message to a woman he trusts in Clearwater." "Ruth Anders," Thomas said without turning around. A pause. "Yes," Dorothy said. She passed word to Ellis that you were moving tonight, and which road. He created a distraction at the office, and I walked out. Her voice stayed even, matter of fact, like she was describing a supply run. I've been on the road since yesterday morning. On foot, Thomas said. I had a horse until the South Creek crossing. The ice broke. I got out. The horse ran. She paused. I kept walking. Thomas thought about the creek crossing. He thought about that creek in January, and a woman climbing out of it, with nowhere to go but forward, and doing it anyway. And he thought about Pearl, saying she isn't afraid of anything. And he thought that was exactly accurate. And he understood completely now where Pearl had gotten the instrument she used to measure the world. Pearl's hand found her mother's arm in the wagon bed. Not grabbing, not clutching, just resting there. Contact. The specific kind that said, I am here, and you are here, and that is the only fact that matters right now. Henry woke and made the sound of a baby who had opinions about the cold, and Dorothy shifted him against her without breaking stride in the conversation, and he quieted. The pass station appeared out of the dark 3 hours before dawn. A low building with a lamp burning in the window and smoke coming from the chimney. Ordinary and solid, and exactly where Thomas had expected it to be. He pulled the horses to a stop in front of it, and sat for a moment, listening to the northwest sky, doing what the northwest sky had been threatening to do for 12 hours. The second storm was close. He could feel it, the way he'd learned to feel things that were coming before they arrived, in the pressure of the air and the silence of the animals, and the particular held breath quality of the world right before it changed. We go through tonight, he said. We don't stop here. Pearl looked at the station. She looked at the sky. She looked at her mother. Dorothy was already looking at Thomas with those clear, steady eyes that had walked out of a broken creek crossing and kept going. Then we go through tonight, Dorothy said. Thomas set the horses moving toward the pass. Behind him in the wagon, Pearl held both her brothers and sat close against her mother's side and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. And Thomas kept his eyes on the road ahead and his hands steady on the reins. And the pass rose before them in the dark, and the storm came in behind them like it was trying to close a door, and they were already through before it did. They came down the other side of Copper Ridge as the storm hit the pass behind them. Thomas heard it before he felt it. The sound of the wind changing register, going from the low, steady push it had been all night to something higher and more serious. The sound of a storm that had been patient long enough and was done being patient. He looked back once and saw the pass behind them disappear into white. The road they'd just traveled swallowed in under a minute like it had never existed. And he turned back to the horses and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say about it. They were through. That was the only fact that mattered. The road down the eastern face of the ridge was steeper than the western approach, and in any other season Thomas would have taken it slowly, carefully, with the brakes set and the horses walking. Tonight he kept them moving at a pace that was faster than careful and slower than reckless, and trusted Belle to find the footing the way she'd been finding footing in hard conditions for 8 years. The gray mare followed. The wagon held. Dorothy sat in the wagon bed with both boys against her and said nothing for the first hour of the descent. Thomas could hear her behind him. Not words, just presence. The low sound of a mother with her children that needed no translation. Pearl sat beside her and was also quiet. The particular quiet of someone whose body had finally begun to understand that the worst of it was behind them, and was in the process of laying down a weight it had been carrying so long it had forgotten the weight was there. Thomas felt the moment Pearl's shoulder dropped. He didn't see it. He was facing forward, eyes on the road. But he heard the change in her breathing. From the controlled, managed rhythm she'd been maintaining for days to something slower. Something that caught once in the middle, and then evened out. And he knew what it meant. He kept his eyes on the road and let her have it. By the time the ridge road flattened into the lower valley, the storm behind them was a wall of white against the sky, and the road ahead was clear and cold and open in the way Wyoming roads were open in January. Wide and flat and indifferent. The kind of road that went on until it arrived somewhere, or it didn't. Thomas pushed the horses to a better pace, and they covered the next 6 miles in the particular focused silence of people who had been moving towards something long enough that the moving had become its own language. The first town on the Denver road was Harwick. Small, a relay station and a feed store and a telegraph office that opened at 7 in the morning. Thomas pulled the horses into the relay yard as the sky was going from black to gray, and the telegraph office was showing a lamp in the window. "I need 10 minutes," he said. Dorothy looked at him from the wagon. She had James asleep against her chest, and Pearl asleep against her shoulder. And she looked at Thomas with those steady eyes that had not changed since he'd found her in the tree line with a lamp and both hands visible. And she said, "What are you sending?" "A message to Cole Decker in Denver, Marshal's office." Thomas wrapped the reins and climbed down, telling him we're coming and what we're carrying, and that the pass is closed behind us, so there's no going back. He paused, and telling him the situation in Redstone. Your situation. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "He'll want the packet before he moves on Vance." "He'll want to know the packet is real, and it's coming. That's enough to get him moving." Thomas looked at her. "Vance is going to know you got out by now. He's going to know the pass is closed, and the mill road is closed, and that whatever went north last night went north for good." He held her eyes. "If Decker knows it's coming, he can make things happen on his end that make it harder for Vance to do damage while we're on the road." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. The measuring look that was her daughter's look. The same instrument, the same precision. Then she nodded once. Thomas went into the telegraph office and came back in 8 minutes and climbed to the seat without a word. And Pearl, who had half woken when the wagon stopped, said without opening her eyes, "Did it go through?" "It went through." She made a sound that was not quite a word and went back to sleep against her mother's shoulder. Thomas set the horses moving south toward Denver and let them find their pace, and held the reins loose in his hands and thought about the message he'd sent. 14 words to Decker after the identification and location. 14 words that laid it out plain and left nothing uncertain. Hayes family and evidence in transit. Vance aware. Pass closed. Expect us in 3 days. Calloway. He had not sent those kinds of messages in a long time, not since the war, when the entire shape of a situation had to be compressed into something a courier could carry, and a commander could read in 30 seconds and act on immediately. He had not missed it. He had not expected to find himself back in that particular mode of urgency, that particular clarity that came when the stakes were real and the margin was small, and every word had to earn its place. But the words had come back to him in the telegraph office without effort, and he'd written them down with the ease of something that had always been there, waiting. Dorothy spoke from the wagon bed somewhere in the second hour. "Ruth Anders," she said. "She helped you." "She did. She knew my husband before he died." A pause. "Samuel spoke of her. Said she was the kind of woman who kept her accounts straight, and her mouth shut, and her door open to people who needed it, and that Wyoming didn't have enough of that kind." Thomas thought about Ruth behind her counter, with a careful, flat voice, and the canvas sack she'd filled without being asked. "He had her right," he said. Another mile passed. "What's your ranch like?" Dorothy said. The question surprised him. Not the asking. He'd come to understand that Dorothy Hayes asked direct questions the same way her daughter did, because it was more efficient than working around to things and Efficiency was a value they both held. But the particular question, not how far, not what's the road, but what's it like? 1,200 acres, he said. Cattle, mostly. Some horses. Good water from the North Creek. The house is... He paused. It's a working house, not fancy. Everything in it has a purpose. He looked at the road ahead. It's been quiet a while. 5 years. Since your wife died, Dorothy said. He looked back at her. Pearl told me, Dorothy said. She was not apologetic about it, just straightforward, the way she was about everything. She said you'd opened a room that had been closed, a room for a child. Thomas turned back to the road. He put his thumb against his knuckle. The night James was sick, he said. First night. I needed a place warm enough, and the back room had a cradle. Mel had made it herself before. He stopped. I'd had the door shut since she passed. I opened it for James. The wagon was quiet. That's a hard thing, Dorothy said. Not softly, just accurately. It was the right thing, Thomas said. Nell would have said the same. He felt rather than heard Dorothy consider this. The quality of the silence that came after had weight in it, a thoughtfulness that wasn't sadness, but was in the same neighborhood. She sounds like she was a good woman, Dorothy said. The best I knew. Pearl said that too, Dorothy said quietly. She said she thought Nell would have liked us. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. Something moved in his chest that he recognized and didn't push away and didn't examine too closely. Just let it be there, the way true things needed to be let alone sometimes. She would have, he said. She'd have taken one look at your family and known exactly what needed doing before I'd figured out the first part of it. Something in Dorothy's voice shifted. And you? Did you know what needed doing? Eventually, he said. I got there. He heard something that was almost a laugh, quiet and brief, from the wagon bed. He didn't turn around to see it, but it moved through the air between them like something that had been there before, like an old sound finding its way back. They rode. Denver came up on the second afternoon. The city appeared in pieces the way cities appeared from open country. First, a smudge of smoke against the sky, then the sound of it, then individual shapes resolving out of the distance one at a time, buildings and streets, and the noise of a place where people had decided to put their lives together in one concentrated spot. Noah pressed his face to the side of the wagon as they entered the first street, eyes wide, taking it in with the particular absorbed silence of a small boy encountering something larger than his current category system. Henry was asleep. Pearl sat up straight and looked at everything and said nothing. And Thomas could see her mapping it, the way she mapped every room, every road, every situation she entered, looking for the exits, the dangers, the angles. Old habit. He didn't think she'd ever fully lose it. He didn't think she should. The marshal's office was on Larimer Street. Thomas had been there once, 8 years ago, on ranch business that had nothing to do with any of this, and he remembered it as a plain building with a plain sign, and the particular no-nonsense atmosphere of a federal office that had real work to do, and no patience for anything that wasn't it. He pulled the horses up in front, and a man came out of the door before Thomas had set the brake. Cole Decker was perhaps 45, lean and weathered in the way of a man who spent most of his working life outdoors, with a badge that had the dull finish of something used rather than displayed, and eyes that assessed Thomas and the wagon and the people in it in about 2 seconds flat. "Calloway," he said. "Marshal?" Decker looked at the wagon. He looked at Dorothy, at Pearl, at the 2 boys. His expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged what he was seeing. Not sentiment, just recognition. The recognition of a man who had been trying to reach exactly this point for 2 years, and had arrived at it, and was now going to do his job. "Come inside," he said. The office was warm, and Thomas was grateful for it. Pearl brought the boys in and found a bench along the wall, and sat with both of them arranged against her, and watched Decker with those clear, undeceived eyes. Henry woke up and looked at the ceiling of a federal marshal's office, with the philosophical calm of a 4-month-old for whom all ceilings were equally interesting. Dorothy set the oilskin packet on Decker's desk. Decker looked at it. He looked at Dorothy. "Mrs. Hayes." "Marshal?" "Your husband did the work," Dorothy said. "I just kept it safe." Decker untied the oilskin and opened it with the careful hands of a man who understood what he was holding. And he read in silence for 6 minutes while the room waited. Thomas stood near the door with his hat in his hands and watched Decker's face move through what was on those pages. Careful, controlled, the face of a man receiving confirmation of something he'd known was true and hadn't been able to prove, and was now holding the proof of in his hands. When Decker looked up, his face was exactly the same as before, but his eyes were different. "This is enough," he said. Dorothy said nothing. "More than enough," Decker said. He looked at Thomas. "Your telegraph said Vance knows the family is in transit. He knew by morning after we left. His man Beale had been at my property the day before." "Beale?" Decker wrote the name. "I know Beale." He wrote something else. "Vance will try to move before I can get warrants processed. He'll try to liquidate what he can and put distance between himself and Redstone." He looked at Dorothy. "Is there anything in here," he touched the packet, "that gives me a county official I can move on first? Someone close to Vance who can't run as fast?" "Page 7, Dorothy said immediately. "Commissioner Aldridge. He took payment 4 times in 18 months. His name appears in my husband's records and in the ledger copies." She paused. "He has a brother-in-law who is a circuit judge. He won't go far." Decker looked at page 7. He looked at Dorothy with something that was as close to admiration as a man of his particular professional disposition was going to show. "You memorized this." "I've had a year and a half to read it," Dorothy said. Decker stood up. "I'll have warrants by morning. I'll ride for Redstone with 4 men by noon." He looked at Thomas. "I'll need formal statements from everyone, today if possible." "Today," Thomas agreed. The statements took 2 hours. Thomas gave his last, after Dorothy and Pearl, and Decker's clerk wrote it all down in a careful hand, while Decker asked questions that were precise and went in a straight line toward what he needed without any detours. Thomas answered the same way. When it was done, Decker read it back, and Thomas signed it, and Decker folded it with the others and put them in a folder that already had Hayes written on the tab in the clerk's careful hand. "One more thing," Decker said. He looked at Thomas. "Vance is going to come after you when this is over. Not directly. He won't do his own work. But he has reach in Harlan County, and he'll use it." He set his pen down. "I want you to know that this office is aware of that, and will be watching it." "I appreciate that," Thomas said. "Don't thank me yet," Decker said. "Thank me when he's convicted." He stood and held out his hand, and Thomas shook it. "You did a hard thing the right way, Mr. Calloway. That's rarer than it should be." Thomas put his hat on. "I just drove the wagon." Decker looked at him with those 2-second eyes. "No," he said. "You didn't." They stayed 2 nights in Denver, in a boarding house on Blake Street that Decker's office arranged. Clean, warm, 3 rooms, a landlady who asked no questions and brought extra blankets without being asked. Thomas slept 8 hours the first night, the deep kind, the kind his body had been waiting on since the night of January 14th, when he'd stood at Nell's grave, and everything that came after had come after. He woke on the second morning to the sound of Henry laughing. Not the short, bright noise from the kitchen 2 days ago, but a full sound, a real laugh. The sound of a baby who had decided the world was funny and wanted to share this discovery with whoever was nearby. Thomas lay still for a moment and listened to it through the wall, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 5 years, and recognized immediately. He got up. Pearl was in the common room with both boys when Thomas came downstairs, Henry on her knee doing the laughing, James watching Henry with the grave attention of a brother who was deciding whether to agree with this assessment of the world. Pearl looked up when Thomas sat down across from her, and she had the expression she sometimes got in the mornings, the one where the careful measuring apparatus was still coming fully online, and what was underneath it was just a child, just Pearl, 11 years old and sitting in a warm room with her brothers. "Decker sent a message this morning," she said. "Warrants were issued at midnight. His men left for Redstone at first light." Thomas poured coffee from the pot on the table. "Fast." "He said Aldridge tried to leave town at 11 o'clock last night." The edge of Pearl's mouth moved. "His horse threw a shoe." Thomas drank his coffee. "My mother's awake," Pearl said. She was looking at Henry, not at Thomas. The careful voice she used when she was saying something that required care. She was asking about the road back. "The pass will be closed 2 weeks at least after the second storm." "I know. She knows." Pearl shifted Henry against her knee. "She was asking about the road that goes around. The lower road." She paused. "The one that goes through Harlan County." Thomas set his cup down. Pearl was still looking at Henry. "Our land in Redstone is gone. Whatever Vance did to the deed, Decker says it'll take months to sort through, maybe longer." She smoothed Henry's blanket with the hand that wasn't holding him. "Decker said there's homestead land available in Harlan County, south section, along the lower creek. Good water. He said the territorial office could process a claim in 2 weeks. She finally looked up at Thomas. "My mother wanted me to ask you how far that land is from your ranch." Thomas looked at her. 9 miles, he said. Pearl held his eyes, direct, clear, nothing hidden behind it, and nothing performing in front of it. Just Pearl Hayes, who had found north by the stars her father taught her, and had walked through a January blizzard on 9 miles of frozen faith, and had never once stopped moving toward the right thing. "That's not far," she said. "No," Thomas said. "It isn't." Pearl nodded once, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she already knew. She looked back down at Henry and James, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did in unguarded moments. Went open and young, and something close to what hope looked like on a face that had spent a long time learning to do without it. Dorothy came downstairs 20 minutes later and sat across from Thomas and accepted the coffee he poured without being asked, and they sat in the morning quiet of the boarding house common room, with Pearl between them, talking to her brothers, and the particular kind of silence that exists between two people who have said most of what needed to be said in harder circumstances, and are now sitting in an easier one, and finding that the things they didn't say are still there, still waiting, still patient. 9 miles, Dorothy said. Pearl told you. Pearl tells me most things. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She said you told her it wasn't far. It isn't. Dorothy looked at her coffee. I don't know what the next year looks like, she said. A new claim, building something from the ground. 2 infants, and a daughter who is 11 going on 40. The edge of her mouth moved. It's not a simple thing. No, Thomas agreed. It isn't. She looked up at him. But you've been doing a hard thing alone for 5 years, she said. And that's not simple either. Thomas looked at her, The steadiness of her, the jaw that had taken a blow and was still set straight. The eyes that had walked out of a broken creek crossing and kept going because there was something worth walking toward. He thought about Nell, who had said he was most himself when he had something worth protecting, who had known him better than he knew himself, and had been right about it. He thought about what it felt like to stop wandering. "Neighbors help each other," he said. "That's how it works out here. Always has been." Dorothy held his eyes, and what was in her face was not simple and not small, and was also not a thing that needed to be named right now, today, in a boarding house on Blake Street in Denver. It was a thing that had time. It was a thing that could be what it needed to be at the pace it needed to be it. And both of them understood that. And the understanding itself was a kind of answer. "Neighbors," Dorothy said. Just the word. No decoration. "To start," Thomas said. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned to Pearl and said, "Finish your breakfast." And Pearl said, "I'm finished." And Dorothy said, "Then go pack what needs packing." And Pearl stood and handed James to Thomas with the easy authority of someone who had decided a thing was true and acted accordingly, and walked upstairs. Thomas held James against his chest. The boy grabbed at his collar with both fists and held on with the complete seriousness of someone for whom holding on was currently the most important work in the world. Thomas put his hand on the small back and felt the breathing, steady and clear, and nothing like the labored sound from the first night in the barn. And he looked out the window at Denver, going about its business in the January cold. And he thought about a ranch 1,200 acres wide, and a fire that had been burning for nobody for 5 years, and a room at the end of the hall that had been closed and then opened, and would not be closed again. 3 days later, they came back through Harlan County on the lower road, and Thomas turned the wagon north of the county line, and Belle picked up her pace the way she always did on the last miles home, knowing the smell of it, knowing the shape of the land. And Pearl, who had been quiet most of the journey, sat up and looked at the country around her, with those clear, assessing eyes, and said nothing. And Thomas watched her look at it, and knew she was mapping it, the way she mapped everything, finding where it fit and what it meant, and whether it could hold what she needed it to hold. It could. He knew it, the way he knew things that were simply true and did not require argument. They came over the last rise, and the Calloway ranch appeared below them. Same fence, same barn, same house sitting solid against the January sky. And Pearl said quietly, more to herself than to anyone, "There it is." And Dorothy beside her said nothing, but her hand found Pearl's arm and stayed there. And Henry made the sound of a baby who approved of whatever this was without fully understanding it. And James slept on as James generally slept, with the complete commitment of someone who had decided that the world could be trusted to continue without his supervision. Thomas pulled the horses to a stop at the gate. He sat for a moment, just sat, and let the quiet of his own land come up around him. The smell of the hay and the horses and the particular cold that belonged to this specific piece of Wyoming, and nowhere else. And he felt it the way he'd felt it 1,000 times, and felt it today entirely differently from every one of those other times. He climbed down and opened the gate, and led the horses through and closed it behind them. And he looked back at the wagon, at Pearl, with her chin up, reading the place like a map, at Dorothy, holding both boys with the ease of a woman who had held hard things with steady hands her whole life, at Henry, grabbing at the winter air and finding it acceptable, at James, sleeping through his own arrival at everything that mattered. And Thomas Calloway understood with a completeness that had no uncertainty left in it what his wife had meant all those years ago. You are most yourself when you have something worth protecting. He had wandered for 5 years, waiting to be that man again. He had not needed to look far. He had needed to open a door. He took the horses to the barn, and he brought his family home.